No one could explain why the albino gorilla was dying. But what the night cameras captured hours later left even the most experienced keepers speechless. Luna lay motionless in the far corner of her enclosure, her pale fur almost glowing under the dim overhead lights, her chest rising so slowly it was hard to tell if she was still breathing at all. And for the first time since she had arrived at the facility 3 years ago, the entire sanctuary felt unbearably quiet, as if even the air itself was holding its breath. Because everyone knew something was wrong, but no one could fix it. Not anymore. Not this time. And Daniel Brooks stood just outside the reinforced glass, his hand pressed lightly against it, watching her from only a few feet away, yet feeling completely helpless. Because Luna, the rare albino gorilla who had once drawn visitors from across the country, now looked like a ghost of herself, fragile, distant, fading. And earlier that day, Dr. Hannah Cole had delivered the kind of news no one ever wants to hear, especially not about an animal like Luna. She had said in a quiet, measured voice that Luna's condition had deteriorated beyond recovery, that her body was shutting down, that even with supportive care there was a high chance she would not make it through the night. And those words had settled over the staff like a heavy fog, leaving behind a silence filled with guilt, regret, and unanswered questions. Because Luna hadn't always been like this. She used to move with curiosity, her pale eyes scanning everything around her, always alert, always searching. But over time something had changed, something no one fully understood. She had begun withdrawing, eating less, interacting less, until eventually she was placed in isolation for her own safety and the safety of others. Or at least that's what the official reports said. But as Daniel looked at her now, barely moving, it didn't feel like safety. It felt like abandonment, and deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had all missed something important, something that might have made a difference. But now it was too late. The monitors showed weak but steady readings. The enclosure temperature had been carefully adjusted, every protocol followed, and yet nothing seemed to reach her. Not the food placed near her, not the soft calls from the staff, not even the familiar sounds of the sanctuary settling into the night. And as the hours passed, one by one, the lights across the facility dimmed, the last of the visitors long gone, the staff retreating to their stations, leaving Luna alone in a pool of pale light, her stillness growing heavier with each passing minute. And somewhere beyond her enclosure, hidden deep within the older, restricted section of the sanctuary that most people had forgotten even existed, something else stirred, something that had not been seen near Luna in years. Something that the system had long since written off. But that night, for reasons no one could yet understand, it began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if drawn by something invisible yet impossible to ignore. Daniel did not leave when the others did. Even as the hallway lights dimmed one by one and the distant hum of the facility settled into its usual nighttime rhythm. Because something about Luna's stillness refused to let him walk away, and as he stood there watching her, he began to replay everything in his mind, every report, every decision, every moment that had led to this quiet, fragile end, and none of it felt right. Not anymore. Not when he looked at her now and saw not just a sick animal, but something deeply alone, something that had been fading long before her body began to fail. And across the enclosure the soft glow of the monitoring equipment cast faint shadows along the walls, numbers blinking steadily, heart rate low but consistent, temperature carefully controlled at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, every variable managed with precision. And yet there was no life behind it, no response, no spark, just a body holding on by instinct alone. And Daniel let out a slow breath, his reflection faintly visible in the glass beside Luna's pale form, wondering if she could still hear anything at all, if somewhere inside she was aware of the quiet, the absence, the distance from everything she once knew. And he almost said her name, almost broke the silence. But something stopped him, something about the weight of the moment that made words feel unnecessary, or maybe too late. And as the clock on the far wall crept past 10:30, the last of the staff completed their rounds, footsteps fading down the corridor, doors closing, radios going silent, leaving the sanctuary in a kind of stillness that felt deeper than usual, heavier, as if the building itself understood what was coming. And it was in that stillness that the first anomaly appeared, so subtle. It could have easily been missed, A faint flicker on one of the security monitors in the adjacent control room. A brief shadow moving along the edge of a restricted corridor that had not been used in years. And at first the automated system registered nothing unusual. No alert. No alarm. Just a momentary distortion that corrected itself almost instantly. But then it happened again. This time slightly clearer. A shape passing between two dim lights. Low to the ground, but unmistakably deliberate. And in the control room a lone night technician, Marcus Hale, glanced up from his desk, narrowing his eyes at the screen, because that section of the sanctuary was supposed to be empty, sealed off after a series of structural issues and never reopened. And yet the movement continued, slow, measured, almost cautious, as if whatever was there knew exactly where it was going, and Marcus leaned closer, adjusting the feed, cycling through angles. But the cameras in that section were old, grainy, offering only fragments of visibility, just enough to confirm that something was indeed there, moving through the shadows, heading in a direction that made his stomach tighten slightly, because the path it was taking led straight toward the active enclosures, toward Luna's section, and back in front of the glass. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, unaware of what was unfolding beyond the walls, his attention still fixed entirely on Luna, whose breathing had grown even quieter now, barely visible unless you watched closely. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, separated by glass but connected by something harder to explain, a shared presence in the silence. And then, somewhere deep within the facility, a faint metallic sound echoed, so soft it blended into the background noise, but just distinct enough to signal that something had changed, something that should not have been possible. And though Daniel did not yet understand it, the night was no longer following the path anyone expected. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he kept his eyes locked on the grainy monitor, the shape now moving with more clarity across the dim corridor, no longer just a flicker, but something real, something large. And as he adjusted the contrast and zoomed in as far as the outdated system would allow, a familiar silhouette began to form, broad shoulders, long arms, a slow and deliberate gait that could only belong to one kind of animal. And his breath caught slightly as a realization began to take hold, because there was only one place that animal could have come from, and it was not supposed to be accessible, not anymore, not after what had happened years ago. And yet the evidence was right there on the screen, moving closer, step by step, toward the active enclosures, and Marcus reached for his radio, hesitating for just a second as he debated whether this was a malfunction or something far more serious. Because if he was right, if that was what he thought it was, then this was not just a system error, it was a breach. And back in the hallway Daniel finally stepped away from the glass, running a hand over his face as fatigue began to settle in, the weight of the day pressing down on him. But just as he turned slightly, a faint vibration echoed through the floor beneath his feet, subtle but unmistakable, like a distant shift in the structure itself, and he paused, listening, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place the source, because the sanctuary was built to be stable, controlled, predictable, and this did not feel like any of those things. And then he heard it, a soft metallic click followed by a low creak somewhere beyond the corridor, and his attention snapped toward the sound, every instinct telling him that something was wrong. And without thinking he moved toward the hallway, his pace quickening as another sound followed. This one heavier, like a door that had not been opened in a very long time finally giving way. And in the control room Marcus made his decision, lifting the radio and speaking into it, his voice low but urgent as he called for Daniel, explaining that there was movement in a restricted zone, that something was heading toward Luna's enclosure, and for a split second the line went quiet. Then Daniel's voice came through, sharper now, alert, asking for confirmation, and Marcus swallowed, glancing back at the screen where the figure had now reached the edge of the camera's view, pausing just long enough to reveal the outline of a face, partially lit, enough to confirm what he feared, and he answered carefully, saying that it looked like a gorilla, but not just any gorilla, one that should not have been anywhere near that corridor. And Daniel's heart began to pound as he turned back toward Luna's enclosure, suddenly aware that the night had shifted in a way he could not control, because Luna was vulnerable, barely conscious, unable to react, and whatever was coming was moving with purpose, not confusion, not panic, but intention, and as Daniel reached the reinforced door leading into the enclosure area, he hesitated for only a fraction of a second before unlocking it. Stepping inside, the air immediately cooler, quieter, heavier, and Luna remained where she was, still unmoving, unaware of what was approaching. And then, from the far end of the enclosure's outer barrier, a shadow stretched slowly across the floor, long and unmistakable, growing larger as it moved closer, and Daniel froze, his breath catching as he realized he was no longer alone in the space, because just beyond the dim perimeter light, something had arrived, something that had crossed boundaries no one thought possible, and for a brief moment the entire world seemed to hold still, waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel's body went rigid as the shadow stretched further into the light, every instinct in him screaming that he needed to act, to protect Luna, to stop whatever had just entered her space, because she was too weak to defend herself, too fragile to even move. And in that moment all the protocols, all the training, all the years of experience collapsed into a single, urgent thought that this was dangerous, that this should not be happening, and slowly, carefully, he reached toward the emergency panel on the wall, his fingers hovering just inches from the alert switch that would trigger a full lockdown, and his mind raced through the consequences, tranquilizers, containment teams, forced separation, all of it designed to neutralize a threat. And as his hand trembled slightly, he finally looked up, forcing himself to face what was in front of him. And what he saw made him hesitate, because the figure stepping into the dim light was not moving with aggression, not rushing forward, not displaying any of the warning signs he had been trained to recognize. Instead, it moved slowly, almost cautiously, each step deliberate, controlled, and as it came fully into view, Daniel felt a jolt of recognition mixed with disbelief, because the gorilla standing just beyond the inner barrier was one he had not seen up close in years, one that had been kept isolated, labeled as unpredictable, removed from public areas and quietly forgotten by most of the staff. And yet there he was, Brutus, larger than Daniel remembered, his posture heavy but not threatening, his gaze fixed not on Daniel, but on Luna, and the room seemed to shift in that instant, the tension no longer sharp but uncertain, confusing, as if the expected danger had been replaced by something far more difficult to understand. And Daniel slowly lowered his hand from the panel, his breath shallow as he watched, waiting for some sign, some movement that would confirm whether this was a mistake, whether Brutus would suddenly lunge or react. But it never came. Instead, Brutus took another step forward, then another, closing the distance between himself and Luna with a strange, almost careful awareness, as though he understood exactly how fragile she was. And behind the glass, Marcus was now watching the same. Seen through a different camera angle, his eyes wide, barely blinking as he whispered under his breath that this was not normal, that Brutus had never been allowed near any other gorilla since his isolation, and certainly not near Luna. And the fact that he had reached her enclosure without triggering any alarms only deepened the confusion, because none of this should have been possible. And yet here it was unfolding in real time, and Daniel, standing just feet away, felt his heart pounding as he took a slow step back, giving space, unsure whether he was witnessing the beginning of something dangerous or something else entirely. And Brutus finally stopped just a short distance from Luna, his massive frame casting a shadow over her still body. And for a moment, everything froze. No movement, no sound. Just the quiet presence of two animals in a space that had never been meant to hold them together. And Daniel held his breath, waiting, because whatever happened next would decide everything. Whether this night would end in tragedy or something no one had ever seen before. For a long moment, nothing happened, and that silence felt heavier than anything Daniel had experienced before, because every instinct in his body expected a sudden movement, a reaction, a sign of aggression. But Brutus remained still, his large frame steady, his breathing slow, his eyes locked not with tension, but with something deeper, something almost unreadable. And then very slowly, he lowered himself to the ground, the motion controlled, careful, as if he was aware of every inch of space between him and Luna. And Daniel felt his chest tighten, because this was not behavior he had ever been trained to interpret, not from Brutus, not from any gorilla in a situation like this. And behind the glass, Marcus leaned closer to the monitor, barely daring to blink, as the camera captured the scene from above, the pale, still form of Luna, and the darker figure of Brutus now crouched beside her, creating a contrast that made the moment feel almost unreal. And then Brutus extended one arm, slowly stopping just short of touching her, as if testing something invisible in the air, and Daniel took an involuntary step forward, his breath catching, because this was the point where everything could change, where one wrong movement could trigger fear or confusion. But instead, Brutus paused, his hand hovering inches away before gently closing the distance and resting it lightly against Luna's shoulder. And the touch was so soft, so deliberate, that it almost did not seem possible, coming from an animal that had been labeled unpredictable for years. And Luna did not react at first, her body still unmoving, her breathing faint. But something shifted in the room, something subtle but undeniable, as if the presence of another being had altered the space itself. And Brutus did not pull away. He remained there, his hands steady, his posture calm. And after a few seconds, he adjusted slightly, moving closer, lowering his head near hers, not pressing, not forcing, just positioning himself beside her in a way that felt intentional. And Daniel realized with growing disbelief that Brutus was not investigating, not asserting dominance, not reacting out of instinct, but choosing something, choosing to stay. And the longer he watched, the clearer it became that this was not random behavior, because Brutus began to shift his body even closer, creating a barrier around Luna, his arms still resting gently against her, as if anchoring her to something real, something present. And Daniel's mind raced, trying to understand what he was seeing, because there had been no training, no precedent for this, no explanation that fit within the rules they had followed for years. And Marcus whispered under his breath that Brutus had never been seen interacting like this, not even before his isolation. And yet, here he was acting with a kind of quiet purpose that made no sense unless there was something deeper, something unseen driving him. And then it happened to change so small, it could have been missed if no one had been watching closely. Luna's breathing shifted, just slightly, not stronger, not fully stable, but different enough to break the pattern that had been fading all night. And Daniel's eyes widened as he leaned closer to the glass, his heart pounding, because for the first time in hours there was a sign, however small, that something inside her was responding. And Brutus remained exactly where he was, unmoving except for the steady rise and fall of his chest, as if he understood that this moment required stillness, not action. And the room, which had once felt like the edge of an ending, now held something else, something fragile but undeniable, something that no one had planned for and no one could explain. Daniel could not take his eyes off the subtle change unfolding in front of him, because what had started as a moment of quiet uncertainty was now becoming something far more significant, something that did not fit into any rule or protocol he had ever followed. And as he leaned closer to the glass, his breathing slowed almost unconsciously, as if matching the rhythm he was watching on the monitor, where Luna's vital signs had begun to shift ever so slightly, her heart rate no longer dropping but stabilizing at a fragile, steady pace. And the temperature sensors showed a gradual increase, not dramatic, not immediate, but enough to suggest that something was helping her body hold on. And Daniel felt a wave of disbelief wash over him, because nothing they had done earlier had produced even the smallest improvement. And yet now, with no medical intervention, no external adjustment, the only variable that had changed was the presence of Brutus, and behind him Marcus was already pulling up additional data streams, his hands moving quickly across the keyboard as he cross-checked the readings, making sure there was no system error, no malfunction that could explain what they were seeing. But everything aligned, the numbers were real, and the change was happening in real time. And Marcus whispered into the radio, his voice tight with disbelief, saying that Luna's condition was stabilizing, not recovering, not yet, but no longer declining. And Daniel closed his eyes for just a second, letting that information settle, because it meant that whatever was happening was not just emotional, not just observational. It was physical, measurable, undeniable. And when he opened his eyes again, he focused on Brutus, who had not moved from his position, his body still curved protectively around Luna, his arm resting gently against her, as if maintaining a connection that he refused to break. And then something even more unexpected happened. Luna's fingers twitched, the movement small, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a jolt through Daniel's entire body, because it was the first voluntary motion she had shown in hours. And he stepped closer, now pressing both hands against the glass, his heart pounding as he watched for any sign of repetition, any confirmation that it was not just a reflex. And a few seconds later it happened again, a slight shift of her hand followed by a faint adjustment of her head, as if she was responding to something beside her. and Brutus reacted not with surprise, but with a subtle change in posture, lowering himself just a little more, bringing his body closer as if he understood that she was becoming aware and needed that presence to remain constant. And Daniel felt something shift inside him, something deeper than relief, something closer to awe, because this was no longer just an unexpected interaction. It was a connection, one that had formed without permission, without planning, without any human guidance. And yet it was doing what none of them had been able to do. It was reaching her, and Marcus's voice came through the radio again, quieter, now almost reverent, as he said that the system logs showed no external interference, no anomalies beyond the initial movement, meaning that everything happening now was entirely organic, entirely driven by the two animals in that room. And Daniel swallowed hard as he realized the full weight of that truth, because it meant that the very creature they had isolated, the one they had labeled unpredictable and kept apart from others, was now the only reason Luna was still holding on. And as the seconds stretched into minutes, the room filled with a quiet intensity, not fear, not tension, but something fragile and powerful, as if everyone watching understood that they were witnessing a moment that should not exist, and yet somehow did. Daniel felt his throat tighten as he continued watching the scene unfold, because what he was witnessing no longer felt like a rare behavioral anomaly, but something deeply emotional, something that carried weight beyond instinct and survival. And he realized that the silence in the room had changed. It was no longer the quiet of something ending, but the quiet of something fragile trying to return, and behind him Marcus had stopped speaking. Entirely, his earlier urgency replaced by a stunned stillness as he monitored the readings that continued to shift in ways none of them had expected. And after a few moments, Daniel heard footsteps approaching quickly down the hallway, followed by the familiar voice of Dr. Hannah Cole calling out his name, her tone sharp with concern, because Marcus had alerted her the moment the data began to change. And when she reached the glass and saw what was happening, she froze mid-step, her expression shifting from urgency to disbelief as her eyes moved between Luna and Brutus, trying to process the impossible scene in front of her. And for a long moment, she said nothing, her breath catching slightly as she stepped closer, placing one hand against the glass, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked what had happened. And Daniel shook his head slowly, unable to offer any explanation, because there was none that made sense within everything they had known. And Hannah's gaze softened as she looked at Luna, whose breathing had now grown more consistent, not strong but no longer fading. And then her eyes moved to Brutus, who remained in the same position, unmoving except for the steady rise and fall of his chest. And there was something in the way he stayed there, something so calm, so deliberate, that it forced her to rethink everything she had believed about him. And after a moment, she spoke again, this time more quietly, almost to herself, saying that this should not be possible, that Luna's condition earlier had shown no signs of reversal, that her body had been shutting down, and yet now the data in front of her told a completely different story. And Daniel felt a wave of emotion rise in his chest, because he could hear the shift in her voice, the transition from clinical certainty to something far more human, something closer to hope. And Hannah took a slow breath, steadying herself as she continued watching. And then she noticed something else, something that made her eyes widen slightly as she pointed toward the screen and asked Daniel if he saw it too. And he followed her gaze to Luna's face, where for the first time her eyes moved, just slightly, not fully open, but enough to show a flicker of awareness, a response to something in her immediate space. And Daniel felt his chest tighten as he realized that she was not just physically stabilizing, she was becoming present again. And Brutus reacted in the same quiet, controlled way, lowering his head just a little more, bringing it closer to hers, as if maintaining a connection that went beyond touch. And Hannah exhaled slowly, her composure breaking just enough for emotion to show as she whispered that they might have been wrong about him all along, that everything they had assumed about Brutus, his isolation, his behavior, his supposed unpredictability, might have blinded them to something they had never taken the time to understand. And Daniel nodded slowly, unable to look away, because in that moment the labels, the reports, the years of decisions all felt distant and irrelevant compared to what was happening right in front of them. And as the seconds passed, the room filled with a quiet realization, one that settled heavily in their hearts, because they were no longer just observing a rare moment. They were witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew, and neither of them could deny it anymore, that the one they had forgotten was now the reason Luna was still fighting to stay alive. Time seemed to slow as the quiet transformation continued inside the enclosure, and neither Daniel nor Hannah dared to move too quickly, as if any sudden action might break whatever fragile connection had formed between the two gorillas, and the monitors now displayed something they had not seen in hours: a steady rhythm that no longer dipped into dangerous levels. Luna's heart rate, holding at a fragile but consistent pace, her body temperature rising gradually by fractions of a degree, and Hannah stepped closer to the control panel, her hands steady, but her eyes filled with a cautious disbelief as she reviewed the data again, making sure there was no misreading, no hidden variable they had missed earlier, and every confirmation only deepened the reality that this was happening exactly as it appeared. And Daniel remained by the glass, his gaze fixed on Luna, as her breathing became more visible, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that felt stronger, more present, and then slowly, almost hesitantly, Luna's eyes opened just enough to reveal a faint awareness, not fully alert, not strong, but unmistakably conscious, and Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat, because that single moment carried more weight than anything else that had happened that night. It was proof that she was still there, still responding, still holding on, and Brutus responded in the same quiet way he had all along, adjusting, only slightly lowering his head closer to hers, his presence unwavering, as if he understood that this moment required patience rather than movement. And Hannah placed her hand against the glass, her voice soft but filled with emotion as she said that Luna was stabilizing beyond what they had projected, that her body was no longer shutting down but attempting to recover. And Daniel turned toward her briefly, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief, because neither of them could ignore what had made the difference. And behind them, Marcus spoke again over the radio, his voice calmer now, but still carrying a sense of awe, as he confirmed that all systems were stable, that no external intervention had occurred, and that Luna's improvement continued to align only with the timing of Brutus's presence. And Hannah exhaled slowly, her composure giving way to something more personal, as she admitted that they had spent years trying to control every variable, every environment, every interaction, believing that careful isolation and management were the best ways to protect the animals in their care. And yet in this moment, it was something entirely outside their control, something they had once prevented that was now bringing Luna back. And Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes returning to the enclosure as he watched the two figures side by side, one fragile and pale, the other strong and steady, and the contrast between them no longer felt like separation, but connection, as if they were completing something that had been missing all along. And minutes passed without interruption, the room quiet, except for the steady sound of the monitors and the soft breathing from within the enclosure. And Luna made another small movement, this time more noticeable, as her head shifted slightly toward Brutus, her fingers curling faintly against the ground. And Daniel felt a surge of emotion he could not fully explain, because this was no longer just survival, it was recognition, it was response, it was something deeper than instinct. And Hannah wiped at the corner of her eye, quickly regaining her focus, but unable to hide the impact of what she was witnessing, because this was not something they could measure with numbers alone. It was something that challenged the very way they understood connection, care, and presence. And as the night continued, the sense of urgency that had filled the sanctuary earlier began to fade, replaced by something far more powerful, a quiet hope that grew stronger with every steady breath Luna took. And with every moment, Brutus remained exactly where he was, refusing to leave her side, as if he knew that this was not over yet, that she still needed him. And for the first time since the night began, Daniel allowed himself to believe that Luna might actually make it through. By the time the first light of morning began to filter faintly through the upper windows of the sanctuary, the atmosphere inside the enclosure had completely transformed from what it had been just hours earlier. The cold tension that once signaled an ending had given way to a quiet, fragile sense of continuation. And Daniel stood there, still watching, unable to bring himself to step away, because every small movement now felt significant. Every breath Luna took carried a weight that had not existed before, and the monitors confirmed what his eyes were already beginning to believe. Her heart rate had stabilized within a safer range, her temperature had risen closer to normal, and though she was still weak, she was no longer slipping away. And Hannah stood beside him, reviewing the latest readings, her voice steady now, but filled with something deeper than professional relief, as she quietly stated that Luna had made it through the night, and that alone was something they had not expected just hours before. And Daniel let out a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding, because hearing those words made everything real in a way nothing else could. and inside the enclosure Luna's eyes were now partially open. Her movements still slow, still limited, but undeniably present as she shifted slightly again, this time leaning just enough toward the warmth beside her, as if instinctively seeking it, and Brutus remained exactly where he had been throughout the entire night, his body still curved protectively around her, his presence constant, unwavering. And as the light grew stronger, it revealed the scene, more clearly the contrast between them no longer stark, but harmonious, as if they belonged in that space. Together all along, and Hannah observed quietly, noting how Brutus had not once shown any signs of agitation, no pacing, no defensive behavior, no attempt to assert control, only a steady calm that suggested intention rather than instinct. And Daniel nodded slowly, his mind still struggling to reconcile what he had witnessed with everything he thought he understood, because Brutus had been labeled unpredictable for years, isolated, for behavior that no one had fully taken the time to understand, and yet in the moment it mattered most, he had done something no one else could, and Marcus's voice came softly through the radio, confirming that all systems remained stable, that Luna's recovery was continuing gradually, and that there had been no external factors influencing the change. And Hannah closed her eyes briefly, taking that in before speaking again, her voice quieter, more reflective, as she said that sometimes the things they try hardest to control are the very things that need connection the most. And Daniel felt that settle deeply, because it was not just about Luna surviving, it was about understanding what had been missing all along. And as the morning continued, the staff began to gather quietly outside the enclosure, each of them drawn by the news, by the impossible story unfolding within, and they stood there in silence, watching as Luna made another small movement, her fingers curling slightly as she adjusted her position closer to Brutus, and for the first time since the night began there was no fear in the room, no uncertainty, only a shared understanding that something extraordinary had taken place. And Daniel looked at Brutus one more time, taking in the stillness, the patience, the quiet.